I still vividly remember the day I arrived at my uncle and aunt's farm to spend my school holidays. It was an isolated place, surrounded by vast fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The dirt road leading to the house was long and winding, and as we got closer, I could feel a mix of excitement and unease growing inside me. My uncle and aunt welcomed me with warm hugs and smiles, and quickly led me inside the large old house. There was an air of rustic charm and coziness, but at the same time, a strange feeling that something was not quite right. The living room was decorated with dark wooden furniture and worn rugs, and a faint smell of earth and hay hung in the air. After a quick tour of the house, my uncle and aunt showed me my room. It was small but comfortable, with an old iron bed and a window overlooking the fields. From there, I could see the solitary figure of a scarecrow in the middle of the fields. It was grotesque, with tattered clothes and an old hat, its arms stretched out stiffly as if it were perpetually on guard. Something about that scarecrow gave me chills, but I tried to ignore it and focus on the excitement of the adventures those holidays promised. During dinner, my uncle and aunt chatted animatedly about life on the farm, the harvest, and the challenges they faced. I listened intently, trying to absorb every detail. However, I couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling the scarecrow gave me. Every time I looked out the window, it was there, motionless, silently watching over the fields. That night, I lay in bed with a mix of tiredness and excitement. Darkness enveloped the farm, and the silence of the countryside seemed almost deafening. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept returning to the scarecrow. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to push away the disturbing thoughts. After all, it was just a scarecrow, an innocent figure meant to scare away birds. With that thought, I finally fell asleep. The next day, I woke up early, eager to explore the farm. The sun was just beginning to rise on the horizon, painting the fields a soft golden hue. I dressed quickly and went downstairs, where my uncle and aunt were already busy with their morning chores. I grabbed a piece of bread and stepped out the front door, determined to take a good look at the scarecrow that had disturbed me so much the night before. As I walked through the fields, the morning breeze gently swayed the plants around me. Each step seemed to echo in the silence of the countryside, and the scarecrow, which had seemed so distant before, now approached rapidly. When I finally got close, I stopped and observed it for a moment, trying to understand why that figure caused me so much discomfort. The scarecrow was indeed grotesque. Its clothes were tattered and dirty, as if they had been dragged through the mud. The hat, too big for its straw head, was tilted to one side, giving it an almost sloppy appearance. But what disturbed me the most were the eyes, or rather, the cavities where the eyes should have been. They were black, empty holes that seemed to stare directly at me without actually seeing anything. The face was a mix of rags and straw, stitched together unevenly, with a crooked mouth that appeared to form a sinister smile. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind made the scarecrow sway, its arms moving slightly as if it were trying to free itself from the stakes holding it up. I took a step back, my heart beating faster. The movement, though natural, seemed almost intentional, as if the scarecrow were trying to move closer to me. I fought the urge to run back to the house and decided to keep watching. I got closer, reaching out to touch the rough fabric of its clothes. The texture was strange, cold to the touch, almost as if it were alive. I quickly pulled my hand back, feeling a shiver run down my spine. With each moment I spent there, the scarecrow's presence seemed to become more oppressive. Something inside me told me there was something very wrong with that figure. I returned to the house with a feeling of relief and confusion, but the image of the scarecrow stayed etched in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was always watching, always present, even when I couldn't see it. The first few nights at my uncle and aunt's farm were peaceful, but that didn't last long. One day, after a long day of exploring and playing in the fields, I returned home exhausted. We had dinner as a family, and I soon retreated to my room, hoping for a night of deep and restorative sleep. I fell asleep quickly, but I was awakened in the middle of the night by a sound I couldn't identify. They were footsteps, firm and fast, as if someone were running through the field. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and looked around, trying to understand what was happening. Through the window, the faint moonlight illuminated the field, and I could see the silhouettes of the crops swaying in the wind. The Scarecrow, however, was there, standing in its place, undisturbed. I lay back down, telling myself it was just the wind or some nocturnal animal. But the sounds continued, more intense and closer. It was as if someone or something was circling the house. I got up again and went to the window, trying to see through the darkness. The silhouette of the Scarecrow was there, but something seemed different. Was it closer to the house? I shook my head, thinking my imagination was playing tricks on me. The noises continued in the following nights. Fast footsteps, indistinguishable whispers, and what seemed to be the sound of something scratching the walls outside. I woke up in a cold sweat, increasingly convinced that something sinister was happening on the farm. My uncle and aunt, however, seemed to notice nothing. When I mentioned the strange sounds, they just laughed and said I was letting my imagination run wild. One night, the sounds were particularly loud. It was a frantic running, followed by a deadly silence, and then a soft tapping on my bedroom window. I sat up in bed, my body paralyzed with fear. The Scarecrow, which I could see from afar during the day, seemed closer than ever. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by my bed and with trembling hands, shone it into the field. Nothing. No figure moving, just the wind swaying the crops. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As the days went by, the pattern continued. I could barely sleep, always alert to any noise. Each night seemed to bring new sounds, new signs that something was wrong. The idea that the Scarecrow might somehow be involved began to grow inside me, a suspicion I couldn't ignore, no matter how irrational it seemed. What was happening on those sinister nights? And why did I feel like the Scarecrow was at the center of it all? After several restless nights, something finally happened that made my blood run cold. It was a moonless night, and the darkness seemed thicker than ever. I was lying in bed, ears tuned to any sound, when I realized everything was eerily silent. No footsteps, no whispers, nothing. It was an oppressive silence that made me sit up in bed with a bad feeling. I got up slowly and went to the window, expecting to see the familiar silhouette of the Scarecrow in the field. But when I looked at the spot where it always stood, my heart nearly stopped. The Scarecrow wasn't there. Only an empty post stood out in the middle of the crops, swaying slightly in the wind. I blinked several times, thinking my eyes were deceiving me, but there was no doubt, the Scarecrow had disappeared. A sense of fear gripped me, and I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run to my uncle and aunt's room, but something stopped me, a morbid curiosity that made me stay put, staring at the empty field. And then, I heard the sound again. Fast footsteps, running through the field, but this time closer, as if they were approaching the house. My whole body trembled, but I managed to gather enough courage to grab the flashlight. With shaky hands, I shone it into the field, moving the light frantically from side to side. Nothing. No figure moving, no suspicious shadow. But the sound of footsteps continued, now around the house, as if something was circling, looking for an entrance. Suddenly, the sound stopped right below my window. The flashlight beam trembled as I pointed it down, trying to see what was there. Nothing. Just darkness and the rustling of the plants in the wind. But I felt that something was there, something I couldn't see. I retreated into the room, closed the curtains, and sat on the bed, trying to control my breathing. What was happening? Why had the Scarecrow disappeared? And what was causing those terrifying noises? That night was the longest of my life. I stayed awake, every nerve in my body on alert, waiting for some sign that everything was normal again. But normality seemed to have left the farm. The Scarecrow had disappeared, and with it, the sense of security I desperately tried to maintain. Finally, when the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the horizon, the fear started to diminish. I looked out the window again, and to my relief and horror, the Scarecrow was back in its place. But something was different. Its clothes were more tattered, and the hat seemed more crooked, as if it had gone through some sort of struggle during the night. That sight only increased my conviction that something very strange was happening on that farm. and I was determined to find out what it was, even if it meant facing the Scarecrow itself. The next morning, after the most disturbing night I had ever experienced, I decided that I could no longer keep my concerns to myself. I needed to talk to my uncle, understand if he knew anything or if he had also noticed the strange things that were happening. I found him in the kitchen, having his morning coffee while reading the newspaper. I sat at the table, trying to find the right words. Uncle Carlos, I began, my voice a little shaky. Can I ask you something? He lowered the newspaper and looked at me with a curious expression. Sure, kid. What's bothering you? I took a deep breath and let it all out at once. I've been hearing strange noises at night. Footsteps, whispers, things scratching the walls. And the Scarecrow. It disappeared one night and came back the next morning. I don't know what's happening, but it's scaring me a lot. My uncle watched me for a moment, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. He set the newspaper aside and took a sip of his coffee before responding. I was hoping you wouldn't notice, but I guess I underestimated your perception. And notice what? I asked, my heart racing. There's something about that Scarecrow that I never wanted to believe, but I can't ignore it anymore. He sighed deeply, as if struggling to find the right words. A long time ago, before you were born, this farm was different. There were more families around here, more life. But then the disappearances started. First, it was the animals. Then people. A chill ran down my spine. Disappearances? What happened? It all started when my father, your grandfather, made that Scarecrow. He always said it was to protect the crops, but there was something about it, something that never seemed right. Over time, I realized that the disappearances coincided with nights when the Scarecrow wasn't in its place. I looked at him, trying to process what I was hearing. You think the Scarecrow is alive? I don't know if alive is the right word, he replied, his face grim. But there's something about it, something we can't understand. I tried to convince myself it was just superstition, that it was all coincidences, but the evidence is hard to ignore. Then why don't you get rid of it? I asked, feeling a mix of fear and frustration. I've tried, he said, his voice low. Many times. But it always comes back somehow. And each time we try to destroy it, things only get worse. It's like it's a part of the farm, a dark and inescapable part. We sat in silence for a moment, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, my uncle put a hand on my shoulder. I know you're scared, and I am too. But we need to be strong. We need to understand what's happening and find a way to stop it. I nodded, feeling a new determination grow within me. That farm held dark secrets, and I was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. Night fell once again over the farm, bringing with it the darkness and silence that had become familiar to me. But this time, I was prepared. Armed with a flashlight and all the courage I could muster, I decided to explore the field, determined to discover what was happening. I waited until my uncle and aunt were asleep and then silently slipped out the back door. The night air was cold, and every sound seemed amplified by the silence around me. I walked slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible as I headed toward the field where the Scarecrow stood. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, making everything even gloomier. As I got closer, the familiar sounds of the previous nights began to emerge. Rapid footsteps and indistinct whispers echoed around me. Fear settled in my chest, but I kept moving forward, the shaky flashlight illuminating the way. Finally, I spotted the Scarecrow, standing in its usual place, but something seemed different. The Scarecrow seemed more disheveled, with its clothes even more tattered and the hat nearly falling off. Its arms, once rigidly stretched, were now slightly drooped, as if losing strength. I was just a few meters away when I heard a sound behind me, a snap, like a branch breaking. I quickly swung the flashlight in the direction of the sound, my heart racing. There was nothing there, just darkness and the rustling of plants. I turned back to the Scarecrow, but it was no longer there, A scream escaped my throat as the flashlight illuminated only the empty post. I started to back away, not taking my eyes off the spot where the Scarecrow should have been. And then, I felt a presence behind me. The air seemed to grow even colder, and the feeling of being watched became almost palpable. I turned slowly, the flashlight shaking violently in my hand. The Scarecrow was there, just a few steps away from me, its empty eyes fixed on mine. I took a step back, tripping and nearly falling. The grotesque figure seemed to have moved on its own, defying all logic. Fear consumed me, but at the same time, a morbid curiosity urged me to stay. "Who, what are you?" I murmured, my voice barely audible. The Scarecrow remained motionless, but the whispers around me seemed to grow louder, as if 100 voices were trying to speak at once. I brought the flashlight closer to its face, trying to see some sign of life, some explanation. But all I saw were rags and straw, a crooked smile stitched onto the fabric, and those empty eyes that seemed to consume me. I decided I had seen enough. With one last look at the sinister figure, I turned and ran back to the house, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the night. The field seemed to close in around me, each plant a threatening shadow, each sound an omen of danger. When I finally reached the safety of the house, I locked the door behind me and leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. The Scarecrow was definitely connected to all of this. And now, more than ever, I was determined to uncover its secret, no matter how terrifying it might be. After my nighttime exploration, things changed on the farm. I spent the following days in a constant state of alert, trying to piece together the puzzle that was the Scarecrow. My nights were haunted by strange and disturbing dreams, where the Scarecrow came to life and whispered dark secrets in my ear. One afternoon, I decided to search the attic of my uncle and aunt's house. It was a dusty place full of old junk, but something told me that the answer I was looking for might be there. After hours of rummaging through old trunks and boxes, I found a diary hidden in a locked drawer. The key was attached to a leather cord, and it seemed that no one had opened it in years. The diary belonged to my grandfather, and its pages were yellowed with age. I sat on the floor, surrounded by shadows and dust, and began to read. As I flipped through the pages, a growing sense of dread took hold of me. What I found there changed everything I thought I knew about the farm. My grandfather described how, during a particularly bad harvest, he had resorted to an ancient ritual to ensure a good crop. It was a ritual passed down through generations, but always avoided due to its dark cost. On a moonless night, he created the Scarecrow, using common materials but with one special ingredient, a cursed object he found at the bottom of a family trunk. The diary didn't specify what the object was, but it said it carried a powerful curse. The Scarecrow was erected in the field, and soon the crops prospered. However, my grandfather began to notice strange things. Animals disappeared, and whispers could be heard on the darkest nights. He tried to undo the ritual, to destroy the Scarecrow, but every time he did, something or someone paid the price. The following pages describe the disappearances my uncle had mentioned, the animals, the neighbors, all mysteriously gone after attempts to destroy the Scarecrow. One entry in the diary caught my attention: the Scarecrow is not just an object. It is a guardian, a prison for something much older and more malevolent. Every attempt to destroy it strengthens what is trapped inside. I don't know how to stop it without releasing the evil it contains. I closed the diary, my mind spinning with the revelation. The Scarecrow was not just an amulet or a symbol of protection, it was a prison for a dark entity, something my grandfather had inadvertently released and tried to contain. And now, decades later, that entity was still there, trapped and furious, trying to break free. With this new understanding, I felt a mix of fear and responsibility. The Scarecrow couldn't simply be destroyed, it needed to be contained, appeased somehow. But how? The answers were there in the pages of the diary, and I needed to decipher them before it was too late. The night I decided to confront the Scarecrow was one of the darkest I had ever witnessed. The moon was hidden by dense clouds, and the silence was almost palpable. Armed with my grandfather's diary and a rudimentary plan, I stepped out the back door, determined to end the cycle of terror once and for all. I crossed the field with firm steps, flashlight in hand, every nerve in my body on high alert. The Scarecrow was there, standing in the middle of the crops, its grotesque figure almost blending with the surrounding darkness. It seemed to be waiting for me, as if it knew this night would be different. I got close enough to see the details of the stitched face, the tattered clothes swaying in the wind. I opened the diary, searching for my grandfather's final entry. He had described a ritual to try to appease the entity trapped in the Scarecrow, a desperate attempt to keep the evil contained. I began to recite the words in a low voice, an ancient language that felt strange in my mouth. The wind around me seemed to grow stronger, and the Scarecrow began to move slightly, as if responding to the ritual. The words flowed from me almost automatically, driven by fear and the hope that it would work. Suddenly, the Scarecrow writhed violently, its outstretched arms seeming to fight against the stakes that held it to the ground. The wind turned into a deafening howl, and I felt a dark presence growing around me. I continued reciting, my voice rising to overcome the noise, trying to maintain control. Then I saw it. From the middle of the Scarecrow, a shadow began to form, an indistinct figure that seemed made of pure darkness. Its eyes, glowing with an ancient evil, locked onto mine, and I felt a chilling cold run down my spine. The entity was breaking free, and I wasn't sure if the ritual would be enough to contain it. With a final effort, I shouted the closing words of the ritual. The shadow hesitated, as if being pulled back, into the Scarecrow. The grotesque figure shook violently, and then with a crash, everything went silent. The Scarecrow fell forward, lifeless, and the shadow disappeared, sucked back into it. Panting, I fell to my knees, the flashlight rolling to the side. The field was silent again, the darkness around me now just the darkness of the night, without the malevolent presence I had felt before. I stood up with difficulty and went to the fallen Scarecrow. It was destroyed, but the sense of danger had passed. The entity, it seemed, was contained again, at least for now. I returned to the house, where my uncle and aunt waited with worried expressions. I told them what had happened, and together we decided to burn the Scarecrow and the remains of the cursed object. It was a risk, but we could no longer live under the shadow of that terror. The fire consumed the Scarecrow quickly, the flames dancing in the night as we watched in silence. When it was all over, a feeling of relief mixed with exhaustion washed over me. The farm was finally free, but the cost had been high. That night marked the end of a dark era and the beginning of a new one. The entity was contained, and the farm, free from its old guardian, could finally know peace.